Rachel Monroe felt it the second she walked into the hospital. Not fear, not anger. Something worse. Finality? The automatic doors slid shut behind her, with a dull hiss, sealing her inside the building she had given nearly half her life to. The fluorescent lights above flickered once, then steadied, casting everything in that familiar pale glow that never cared whether it was day or night. Rachel adjusted the strap of her worn canvas bag on her shoulder and glanced down at her ID badge. It still worked, for now. 17 years. 17 years of night shifts, missed birthdays, and holidays spent under buzzing lights, while other people slept beside their families. She had watched new nurses come and go, doctors rise and fall, administrators change names, but not attitudes. Tonight was supposed to be just another shift, but everyone knew better. Her phone vibrated before she reached the locker room. HR. Please confirm receipt of your evaluation notice. She didn't open it. She already knew what it said. Rachel changed into her scrubs slowly, folding her street clothes with care, like someone packing for a trip she didn't want to take. She checked her reflection in the small mirror. Tired eyes. Lines she didn't remember earning. A woman who still showed up anyway. The ICU doors opened, and chaos rushed toward her. Monitors chirped. A ventilator groaned. A resident's voice cracked as he called out vitals that didn't sound good. A patient had been brought in minutes before shift change. Male. Unknown identity. No insurance flagged in the system. Severe respiratory distress. The kind of patient administrators hated because he couldn't be neatly categorized or billed. Rachel didn't wait for instructions. She moved to the bedside, gloved up, and scanned the monitor in one practiced glance. Oxygen saturation unstable. Heart rate erratic. She adjusted the ventilator settings, corrected a medication dosage without raising her voice, and leaned close enough for the patient to hear her. "You're still here," she said softly. "Stay with me." The man's chest shuddered beneath the sheets. Then the air in the ICU changed. Heels clicked against the floor, sharp and deliberate, cutting through the noise. Conversations dropped mid-sentence. Even the resident went quiet. Rachel didn't have to turn around to know who it was. Rachel Monroe. Evelyn Crow's voice was calm, polished, and unmistakable. Rachel straightened slowly and faced her. Perfect suit, perfect posture, not a hair out of place. Evelyn didn't look at the patient. "Step away from the bed," Evelyn said. Rachel blinked. "He's not stable." Evelyn smiled faintly. "This patient is not approved for extended ICU care. We have a priority admission arriving." Rachel stared at her. "If we disconnect him, he will die." "That is no longer your concern," Evelyn replied. Two security guards appeared at the entrance, hands clasped, eyes fixed anywhere but on Rachel. Every nurse in the unit was watching. No one spoke. Rachel looked back at the monitor. The numbers dipped again. She knew what walking away would mean. She also knew what staying would cost her. Rachel tightened her grip on the bed rail and said, steady and clear, "I'm not leaving." And as alarms erupted across the ICU, Rachel had no idea that this single sentence was about to summon forces far beyond the hospital's control. The alarms kept screaming as Rachel stood frozen for half a second too long, her hand still wrapped around the cold metal rail of the ICU bed. The sound dragged her backward through time, pulling memories she usually kept locked. She had been 24 when she first put on these scrubs. Younger than most. Hungrier than all of them. Back then, she still believed that working hard was enough, that if you showed up and did the right thing, the system would eventually. She learned how wrong that was. The night her husband died, Daniel Monroe had been an EMT, the kind who ran toward smoke instead of away from it. They were newly married, barely scraping by, dreaming small dreams because that was all they could afford. One rainy night, his unit was dispatched to a multi-car pileup on the interstate. A drunk driver, no warning. One second he was talking about dinner plans. The next, Rachel was identifying his body under fluorescent lights. She came back to work 3 weeks later because grief didn't pay rent, and hospitals didn't stop needing nurses. She learned how to function on 4 hours of sleep, how to smile at patients while her chest felt hollow, how to swallow pain and keep years past. Promotions came and went without her name on them. She worked nights because someone had to. She trained new nurses who would later outrank her. She watched administrators praise team spirit while cutting staff and bonuses. When her mother started forgetting names and leaving the stove on, Rachel took extra shifts. When her son came home bruised and silent from school, she held him and told him the truth. Life wasn't fair, but they would survive it together. That was Rachel's reputation now. Reliable, quiet, unmovable, difficult. She questioned discharge orders when patients weren't ready. She documented everything. She refused to look away when corners were cut. More than once, supervisors had told her, gently at first, then not so gently, that she needed to be more flexible. She never was. Back in the ICU, Evelyn Crow watched her with polite impatience, like someone waiting for a slow cashier to hurry up. The security guards shifted their weight. The young nurse at the next bed, Lena, had tears in her eyes and no idea what to do. Rachel looked at the patient again. His skin was gray, his breath shallow. No family, no name. Just a human being losing a fight he never chose. She thought of her son waiting at home, pretending to be brave, of her mother's fading memories, of the HR email still unread in her pocket. She understood, in that moment, how much power Evelyn believed she had. What Evelyn didn't understand was this. Rachel Monroe had already lost everything once. There was nothing left to threaten her with. She adjusted the ventilator, despite the order. Her hands were steady. Her voice didn't shake when she called out instructions to the resident. For a brief second, the patient's oxygen level climbed. Evelyn's smile disappeared. "This is your final warning," Evelyn said quietly. "You are finished here." Rachel didn't look at her. She kept her eyes on the monitor and answered, just as quietly, "Then do what you need to do." And as security stepped forward, none of them noticed the first call being placed from the hospital's upper floors, one that would change the fate of everyone in this room. Security moved closer, slow enough to pretend this was still civilized. Rachel felt the shift before anyone spoke again. The ICU had gone quiet in that unnatural way that only happened when people were afraid to breathe too loudly. The alarms still sounded, but now they felt distant, like a warning no one intended to answer. "Escort her out," Evelyn Crow said, her voice low and controlled. Not angry, not rushed. The kind of tone used by people who had practiced this moment in their heads long before it arrived. One of the guards cleared his throat. "Ms. Monroe, please step away from the patient." Rachel finally turned to face them. She saw discomfort on their faces. She recognized it. They weren't cruel men. They were just doing their jobs. The same excuse she had heard for years whenever something wrong happened inside these walls. "He's not stable," Rachel said again, slower this time, as if repetition might turn truth into permission. "You remove support now. He won't make it 5 minutes." Evelyn glanced at her watch. "That is not your concern. You are no longer authorized to provide care." The words hit harder than the threat of being fired. No longer authorized. As if 17 years could be erased with a sentence. Around them, nurses stood frozen. Lena's hands shook as she clutched a chart. Dr. Whitaker hovered near the doorway, his jaw tight, eyes darting between Rachel and Evelyn. He opened his mouth once, then closed it. Silence won. Rachel reached up slowly and unclipped her badge. The plastic caught briefly on the fabric of her scrub top before coming free. She held it for a second longer than necessary, feeling its familiar weight, then placed it on the counter beside the bed. The patient's oxygen dropped again. "Rachel," Lena whispered, barely audible. "Please." Rachel leaned in, ignoring the guards now inches away. She adjusted the ventilator one last time, her movements precise, muscle memory guiding her hands, even as her chest burned. The numbers climbed just enough to buy seconds, maybe a minute. Evelyn's patience snapped. "Now!" The guards took her by the arms, not roughly, almost apologetically. Rachel didn't resist. She let them pull her back, step by step, away from the bed. Away from the man whose life depended on people who had already decided he was expendable. As she crossed the threshold of the ICU, Evelyn spoke again, louder this time. Rachel Monroe is terminated effective immediately for insubordination and violation of hospital protocol. Every word echoed. Patients' family members looked up from waiting room chairs. A resident stared at the floor. Someone's phone lifted slightly, recording without realizing it. Rachel's locker was cleared in minutes. Personal items dumped into a cardboard box, like an afterthought. A framed photo of her son slid sideways, glass cracked. No one apologized. They escorted her toward the exit, past walls lined with awards about excellence and compassion. The hypocrisy was almost impressive. Outside the ICU doors, Rachel stopped. "Don't let him die," she said quietly, not to Evelyn, but to anyone who could still hear her. No one answered. The doors slid shut, sealing the unit off from her for the last time. And as Rachel was walked toward the night air, far above the hospital roof, a red light began to blink, signaling an arrival no one inside was prepared for. The night air hit Rachel Monroe like a slap. Cold, damp, unforgiving. It carried the distant sound of traffic and the smell of rain-soaked concrete, a sharp contrast to the sterile warmth she'd just been expelled from. The automatic doors slid shut behind her, with a final hiss, as if the building itself was relieved to be rid of her. The security guards stopped just outside the entrance. One of them, Frank Dalton, avoided her eyes. He had gray at his temples and a posture that spoke of old discipline, the kind earned in places far worse than a hospital corridor. "I'm sorry," he muttered, handing her the cardboard box with her belongings. "You know how it is." Rachel nodded. She did know. That was the problem. Inside the box was her life in fragments, a cracked photo frame of her son at 12, grinning with a missing tooth. A cheap pen she'd borrowed from a doctor years ago and never returned. A pair of compression socks washed so many times they'd lost their elasticity. No plaque. No letter. No acknowledgement of 17 years spent holding other people together while quietly coming apart herself. Behind the glass doors, she could still see movement. Shadows rushing. Staff pretending not to look at her. Somewhere beyond those walls, a man she didn't know was still fighting for air. Rachel set the box down on the bench and sank beside it. Her hands finally started to shake. Her phone buzzed. Mom's Care Center, missed call. She closed her eyes, pressing her thumb against the screen without calling back. She couldn't afford to hear bad news right now. She barely had enough strength left to stay upright. Through the glass, she spotted Evelyn Crow one last time. Evelyn stood near the nurse's station, speaking calmly into a phone, already spinning the story. Policy violations. Difficult employee. Necessary action. Rachel could almost hear the words forming. By morning, she would be a footnote, a cautionary tale told in management meetings. A young woman approached the doors and hesitated. Lena. Her eyes were red, her face pale. "I tried," Lena said through the glass, her voice muffled when she stepped outside. "Dr. Whitaker wouldn't. No one would." Rachel shook her head gently. "It's okay, you did enough." Lena swallowed hard. "They're clearing the bed." That sentence landed heavier than the termination notice. Rachel stood abruptly, heart hammering. She took one step toward the doors, instinct screaming at her to go back, to fight, to do something. Frank shifted slightly, blocking her path without touching her. "You can't," he said softly. Rachel stopped. She knew he was right, and she hated that he was. Above them, a low hum cut through the night. At first, she thought it was thunder. Then the sound grew louder, sharper, mechanical. Wind whipped across the hospital entrance, tugging at her hair, rattling loose paper across the pavement. Lena looked up first. "What is that?" Rachel followed her gaze. A blinking red light pierced the clouds. Then another. The hum deepened into a roar that made the glass doors vibrate. Frank straightened slowly, his eyes narrowing as recognition flickered across his face. "That's not news," he said. "And that's not medical transport." Rachel's breath caught as the first helicopter descended toward the hospital roof, followed closely by a second, its lights cutting through the darkness like a blade. No one moved, no one spoke, and as the helicopters prepared to land, Rachel had no idea they were about to ask for the one person the hospital had just thrown away. The helicopters settled onto the rooftop with a force that rattled the bones of the building. Inside the hospital, conversations died mid-sentence. Phones stopped ringing. Even the alarms in the ICU seemed to fade beneath the heavy thrum of rotating blades. People looked up from charts, from screens, from coffee cups frozen halfway to their mouths, all sharing the same unspoken question. What was happening? Rachel stood at the entrance, the wind from the rotors whipping her hair across her face, her box of belongings forgotten at her feet. For a moment, she wondered if this was some cruel coincidence, the universe's way of twisting the knife a little deeper on the worst night of her life. Then the rooftop access doors burst open. Men in dark jackets moved fast, purposeful, radios clipped to their shoulders. Not hospital security, not media. Their movements were too precise, their expressions too focused. One of them spoke quickly into his headset, eyes scanning the entrance below. "Confirm Monroe is on site," he said. Rachel felt her stomach drop. Inside, Evelyn Crow froze mid-sentence. The phone slipped slightly in her hand as she watched the unfamiliar group move through her hospital like they owned it. She straightened instinctively, the practiced confidence returning to her posture. "Who authorized this?" she demanded, stepping forward. No one answered her. A man with silver hair and a calm, unreadable face approached the nurse's station. "We need access to your ICU records from 14 years ago," he said. "Immediately." Dr. Whitaker blinked. 14 years? "Yes," the man replied. "C, specifically related to a mass casualty response team operating under federal authority." Evelyn's face lost its color. "That's classified," she said sharply, "and you cannot disrupt operations." The man finally looked at her. His gaze was cool, assessing. "Ma'am, you already have." Outside, Frank turned slowly toward Rachel. His voice was low, almost reverent. "They're asking for you." Rachel laughed once, a short, disbelieving sound. "You've got the wrong person." Frank shook his head. "No, they don't make mistakes like that." Before she could respond, one of the men from the rooftop descended the steps and stopped directly in front of her. He studied her face, then checked the tablet in his hand. "Rachel Monroe?" he said, not a question. "Yes," she replied, her voice barely steady. "We need you back inside." Rachel's chest tightened. "I was terminated." The man nodded. "We're aware." Lena appeared behind the glass doors, eyes wide, hands shaking. Dr. Whitaker followed, disbelief etched across his face. Even Evelyn had moved closer now, listening, calculating. "For what?" Rachel asked. "I don't even know why you're here." The man leaned in just enough for only her to hear. "Because a patient upstairs is dying," he said, "and you are the only person on record who's ever kept someone alive with this specific injury pattern." Rachel felt the world narrow to a single point. "Who is the patient?" she asked. The man hesitated, just long enough to matter. "Someone the government cannot afford to lose," he said. Behind her, the hospital doors slid open again, and as Rachel stepped back inside, every rule that had just destroyed her began to bend. Rachel walked back through the hospital doors like someone entering a place she no longer recognized. Every step felt wrong. Minutes ago, she had been an ex-employee, escorted out with a box of memories and no future. Now, people were stepping aside for her, eyes following her with confusion and something close to fear. The rules hadn't changed. The power had. The man from the helicopter stayed at her side as they moved through the corridor. His presence was steady, deliberate, like gravity. You were part of a federal rapid response medical unit after the attacks, he said quietly. Your file was sealed. Most people in this building don't even know it exists. Rachel swallowed. That was a lifetime ago. It doesn't matter, he replied. Experience like that doesn't expire. They reached the ICU doors. Inside, everything was louder than she remembered. The alarm screamed again, relentless now. The patient lay exactly where she had left him, skin pale, chest rising unevenly under the ventilator. A new team surrounded the bed, tense and lost, throwing interventions at a problem they didn't fully understand. Dr. Whitaker looked up and froze. Rachel? She nodded once. No time for explanations. Evelyn Crow stood near the back of the unit, arms crossed, jaw clenched so tight the muscles twitched. Her eyes followed Rachel, sharp and calculating. She stepped forward. She is not employed here, Evelyn said, forcing control into her voice. She cannot touch that patient. The man from the helicopter turned to Evelyn for the first time. Ma'am, he said calmly, you are interfering with a federal emergency. The word federal landed hard. Evelyn's face flushed. This is my hospital. And that, the man replied, is no longer relevant. Rachel didn't wait for permission. She moved to the bedside, the familiar rhythm of crisis snapping back into place. She scanned the monitor, the ventilator settings, the subtle signs no chart could capture. Her mind shifted gears, leaving fear behind. This isn't standard respiratory failure, she said. His lungs are reacting to trauma-induced embolic damage. You're ventilating him wrong. A resident started to protest, then stopped when she adjusted the settings and the oxygen saturation climbed. Just a little. Enough to matter. Rachel leaned close to the patient again. I'm here, she whispered. You're not dying tonight. Her hands moved with purpose. She gave orders, clear and precise. People listened. Even Evelyn said nothing now. Then Rachel felt it. A sharp dizziness. The room tilted for half a second before she caught herself on the bed rail. Weeks of exhaustion, stress, and suppressed adrenaline surged all at once. She hadn't eaten since morning. She hadn't slept properly in days. Dr. Whitaker noticed. Rachel, you need to sit. I'm fine, she snapped, harsher than she meant. She forced herself upright. If I stop now, he dies. The man from the helicopter watched her closely. If you collapse, he said, we lose you too. Rachel met his gaze, defiant and tired. Then you better make sure I don't. Behind them, Evelyn Crow stared at the scene she could no longer control, something like panic finally cracking her composure. And as Rachel pushed herself past her limits, the truth she had buried for years began clawing its way back into the light. Rachel's hands kept moving, but her mind was racing ahead of her body now. The patient's oxygen levels stabilized just enough to buy time, the kind of fragile window that could slam shut at any second. Sweat traced a line down Rachel's spine beneath her scrubs. She ignored it. She had lived inside worse moments than this. Moments where screaming crowds pressed in, where blood soaked through gloves faster than they could be changed, where decisions had to be made without names, without permission, without mercy. The man from the helicopter stood beside her, watching everything. You're remembering, he said quietly. Rachel didn't look at him. I never forgot. He nodded once. After the attacks, you were assigned to a mobile response unit that officially never existed. No press, no commendations, no paper trail that could be subpoenaed. He lowered his voice further. You treated high-risk individuals when hospitals were compromised, when politics were dangerous. Rachel adjusted a line, jaw tight. And when people didn't want witnesses. Across the unit, Evelyn Crow stiffened. She had moved closer without realizing it, drawn by something she could feel slipping through her fingers. Her eyes darted between Rachel and the man, searching for leverage that was no longer there. What does this have to do with me? Evelyn demanded. The man turned to face her slowly. Everything. He tapped his tablet, pulling up a file. 14 years ago, a critical patient was removed from a federal protection unit under your administrative authority. The justification cited resource strain and liability exposure. Evelyn scoffed. I don't remember every decision I've ever made. You remember this one, he replied calmly, because the patient died, and because the nurse who protested that removal documented every objection. Rachel felt her chest tighten. That nurse was you, he continued. Rachel Monroe. Your documentation disappeared, but copies were preserved elsewhere. Evelyn's face drained of color. This is irrelevant, she snapped. You can't prove. We already have, the man said, and tonight's patient has injuries consistent with the same covert extraction attempt. The room felt smaller. The beeping of machines seemed louder. Rachel finally looked up. You didn't come because of him, she said, realization settling in. You came because this is happening again. The man met her gaze. Yes. Dr. Whitaker stared between them. You're saying this isn't a coincidence? No, the man replied. It's a pattern. Rachel exhaled slowly, grounding herself as the weight of it pressed down. All the times she'd been told she was difficult, all the warnings to be flexible, all the moments she'd felt watched for refusing to stay quiet. She leaned closer to the patient. You're not disposable, she murmured. Not tonight. Evelyn took a step back, her confidence finally cracking. You can't do this, she said, voice sharp with panic. You can't turn this into accountability, the man finished. Watch us. Rachel adjusted one final setting, then stepped back just enough to breathe. The patient's vitals held steady. For now. She straightened, exhaustion crashing into her all at once, but her eyes were clear. She had survived the night she thought ended her career. Now the system that tried to erase her was about to answer for it. And as federal investigators began sealing off offices upstairs, Rachel realized this shift was no longer about saving one life, but exposing the cost of every life they had sacrificed before. The ICU no longer felt like a battlefield. It felt like a courtroom. Federal personnel moved quietly along the edges of the unit, speaking into headsets, sealing doors Rachel had walked through freely for years. Computers were logged out remotely. Access badges stopped working mid-swipe. Somewhere upstairs, offices were being opened that hadn't expected visitors before sunrise. Rachel stood at the patient's bedside, hands finally still. For the first time all night, the monitors held steady. Not perfect, not safe, but stable enough to breathe again. She let herself take one slow inhale, then another, grounding her feet against the floor. Her knees trembled now that adrenaline no longer held them together. Dr. Whitaker came to her side. His voice was low. You did it. Rachel shook her head. He's not out of danger. But he's alive, Whitaker said, because of you. She didn't answer. Praise felt unfamiliar, almost uncomfortable, after years of being told she was a problem. She focused instead on the rhythm of the machines, the small, stubborn proof that standing her ground had mattered. Across the room, Evelyn Crow sat rigid in a chair she hadn't chosen. Two agents stood nearby, not touching her, not threatening her, but making it clear she was no longer in charge of anything. Her phone lay face down on the counter, confiscated. The perfect composure she'd worn all night was gone. What remained was calculation edged with fear. This is outrageous, Evelyn said, forcing steadiness into her voice. You're disrupting patient care. You're overstepping. You overstepped 14 years ago, one of the agents replied calmly. Tonight, you repeated the mistake. Rachel met Evelyn's eyes for the first time since returning. There was no anger there, no satisfaction, just clarity. You told me this wasn't my concern, Rachel said quietly. It never stopped being. Evelyn looked away. The man from the helicopter approached Rachel again. We're relocating the patient, he said. Secure facility. But before that, we need your recommendation. Rachel hesitated. I was fired. He gave a small nod. Temporarily. The word landed softly, but carried weight. I don't want my job back like this, Rachel said. Not as a favor. You won't get it as one, he replied. You'll get it because we need someone who won't look away. Rachel considered that. The years she'd spent being invisible. The night she'd almost been erased entirely. Then we do it properly, she said. With oversight, transparency. Agreed. As preparations began, Lena slipped up beside her, eyes bright with relief. They're saying you're in charge now, she whispered. Rachel almost smiled. Outside, dawn crept slowly over the city, pale light filtering through the ICU windows. The night that had taken everything from her was ending differently than it began. Rachel straightened her shoulders as the patient was prepped for transfer, every movement precise, controlled. She wasn't just back inside the hospital. She was standing exactly where she belonged, and as the patient was wheeled away alive, Rachel didn't yet realize the reckoning waiting for Evelyn Crow would be far more public than anyone imagined. By the time the sun cleared the skyline, the hospital no longer belonged to Evelyn Crow. Conference rooms were locked down. Emails froze mid-send. Administrators who had avoided the ICU all night were suddenly summoned, pale and confused, clutching coffee they didn't have time to drink. Federal badges replaced executive titles with quiet efficiency. No shouting, no spectacle, just authority that didn't ask permission. Rachel watched it unfold from a distance. She stood near the nurse's station, hands wrapped around a paper cup someone had pressed into her palm. The coffee had gone cold, but she didn't mind. For the first time in years, no one was telling her where to be or what to do. They were waiting. Evelyn was escorted from her office shortly after sunrise. Not dragged, not handcuffed. Worse than that, walked out slowly, flanked by people who refused to meet her eyes. Her heels echoed down the corridor she once ruled, each step stripping away another layer of the power she had mistaken for permanence. Staff stopped pretending not to watch. Phones came out. Whispers spread. Names were said out loud for the first time. Policies that had crushed nurses and patients alike were suddenly traced back to signatures, emails, deliberate choices. Evelyn's. She turned once, searching the crowd. Her gaze found Rachel. For a heartbeat, something unguarded flickered across Evelyn's face. Not anger, not fear, recognition. She understood now exactly who she had tried to erase and how badly she had miscalculated. Rachel didn't look away. The agents paused Evelyn near the elevators. One read from a tablet, voice calm and precise. You are being placed on immediate administrative leave pending investigation into multiple violations, including falsification of records, coercive discharge practices, and obstruction of federally protected medical operations. The words hit like a verdict. Evelyn opened her mouth, then closed it. For once, there was nothing she could say. As the doors slid shut behind her, the corridor exhaled. Dr. Whitaker let out a breath he'd been holding for years. Lena wiped her eyes, half laughing, half crying. Frank stood a little straighter, as if an old weight had finally lifted. Rachel felt no triumph, just a deep, steady sense of balance returning. An agent approached her again. Your termination has been nullified, he said. Effective immediately. Your record will reflect full compliance. Rachel nodded. And the patient? Stable. Transferred safely. She closed her eyes for a second, relief cutting through exhaustion. There's more, the agent continued. We'd like you to review internal care protocols with us. Officially. Rachel studied his face. You want me to help fix this. We want you to make sure this doesn't happen again. She thought of every patient pushed out too early, every nurse silenced, every night she'd driven home, wondering how much longer she could keep going. I'll do it, she said, but it won't be quiet. A small smile crossed his face. We wouldn't expect it to be. The monitors behind her beeped steadily. Morning shift arrived, stepping into a hospital that felt different, even if they didn't yet know why. Rachel straightened, setting the coffee aside. Justice hadn't arrived with sirens or speeches. It came with consequences. And as news crews gathered outside, unaware of how close they'd come to missing the real story, Rachel realized the final reckoning was about to go public. Morning light spilled through the hospital's glass facade, soft and pale, like it was trying not to disturb what had just happened inside. Rachel Monroe stepped out onto the front steps and stopped there for a moment, letting the city breathe around her. Traffic moved. People hurried past with coffee cups and headphones, unaware that a system had cracked open overnight just a few floors above them. The world hadn't changed, but hers had. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. "Mom's awake," the message read. "She's asking for you." Rachel closed her eyes, relief washing through her so strongly her knees almost gave out. For the first time in weeks, she didn't feel like she was running behind disaster. She typed back, "I'm on my way," and meant it without guilt. Behind her, the hospital doors opened again. Dr. Whitaker stepped out, blinking in the sunlight like someone emerging from a long tunnel. "They're setting up an interim review board," he said. "They asked if you'd co-chair." Rachel considered that. Power had never interested her, but protection had. "I'll help," she said, "on one condition." Whitaker smiled faintly. "I figured you'd have one." "No patient gets moved because of money alone," Rachel said. "Ever again." Inside the building, Evelyn Crow's name was already being scrubbed from signage, from email chains, from polite conversation. By noon, her resignation would be public. By nightfall, the investigation would be everywhere. There would be statements, apologies, promises of reform. Rachel knew better than to believe all of them. What mattered was that this time, there were witnesses. She walked down the steps, passing the bench where her cardboard box still sat. She picked it up, then stopped, reconsidered. Slowly, she set it back down and removed only the photo of her son, the cracked glass catching the light. That box belonged to the woman she had been. She was done carrying it. Her son was waiting across the street, backpack slung over one shoulder, trying to look grown while scanning every face that exited the hospital. When he saw her, relief broke through his careful composure. He crossed the street without looking, wrapped his arms around her, and held on. "You okay?" he asked quietly. Rachel hugged him back, breathing him in. "Yeah," she said. "I am?" They walked away together as sirens approached from the other direction, not for her this time, but for a story finally catching up to itself. Rachel didn't feel rich. She didn't feel powerful. She felt steady. She had her job back, not as a favor, but as a necessity. She had a voice where silence had once been demanded. She had the quiet knowledge that doing the right thing, even when it cost everything, could still come back to meet you. Not with applause, with justice. And as the hospital behind her braced for scrutiny, Rachel walked forward knowing this time, no one would ever be able to erase her again.